I am not here to be right. I am here to get it right. Less armor, more learning. Brené Brown. Welcome back, beautiful listeners. Listen, small PSA. I am batshit passionate about the power of knowledge. And I believe that our attachments to our attitudes can sometimes blind us to personal growth and betterment. And I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person who wants to know more than what I think I already do, which is why I reached out to Valiant Richey, Special Representative of the OSCE and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings. That was a mouthful, guys. And I asked him to not just be our guest, but to help me reach a better understanding of End the Demand. Because as some of you may have heard in my previous episode with Caitlin Bailey, my understanding of End the Demand has been limited to seeing it as a sexy soundbite to end prostitution. Anyways, we really get into it this episode. Val was such a pleasure to talk to and learn from, and I can honestly say that I am so excited to have him back for a second episode where we get to talk about what it looks like on his end to combat human trafficking from a global position and also the history of exploitation from around the world. So tell a friend, hit subscribe, and enjoy the following episode. Good morning, podcast listeners. This is Rayanne joining you today. I have with me special guest, OSCE Special Representative for Combating Human Trafficking, Val Richey with me. How are you doing today, Val?
I'm great, Rayanne. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for taking the time to come on. You are located, I believe, in Vienna now?
That's right, Vienna, Austria.
Wow. But you are from originally, or you were working out of Washington, was it?
That's right. I lived in Washington State for about 20 years before I moved to Vienna. And the last 13 years or so of that was spent working in Seattle.
Oh, okay. That's not too far from me. I'm in Vancouver.
Yeah, I used to go to Vancouver all the time. It's a great city.
It is fantastic here. So is Seattle, though. I don't actually get over there enough, especially right now with the whole COVID thing going on. So...
Yeah, it's a little, it's tough crossing borders right now, but also there's obviously the forest fires that have been going on, and so there's kind of a lot in the neighborhood there. I imagine you got some smoke up in Vancouver as well.
Oh, it was really bad for about a week. The air quality was horrible, and we just had a breeze about 2 days ago, started coming through, and the rain, of course, thank goodness for Vancouver rain. So everything is... honestly, it's just as it was, which is, great for us. And, we're hoping the best for everybody else. So
that's great. I hope you and your family and friends are staying healthy and safe during this challenging time.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice of you. So we have a lot to cover and very limited time for those joining and listening. It is 8:00 my time. So I'm just still have... my brain is still out of whack. And for you, it's like the tail end of your working day. So your brain must be tired. So I guess we'll just kind of jump right in. I myself was sex trafficked. And when I got off the streets, I hid from the world in order to heal. And I have essentially had my head buried in the sand as far as knowing what was going on for everybody else. Because when I was growing up, it wasn't called sex trafficking, it was called prostitution. And so when I came across yourself and a bunch of other organizations and I started learning more, I went, wow, so much has changed in the world. And I was just wondering if you could touch down for us what is OSCE anti-trafficking, and what is it that that you guys are working towards right now?
Sure. Well, Rand, first of all, I think a lot of topics related to this have changed over time too. Sexual harassment, used to not be called sexual harassment. It was called sort of a day at the office with a jerky boss. So I think we're becoming a lot more attuned to how people in positions of power or control have taken advantage of that position and to exploit or use other people for their own purposes, which are often not good purposes. So I can certainly understand how things may have changed over time, and that can be a big deal when you start to get faced with that. So that's intense, and thanks for sharing that. So the OSCE, yeah, it's not an organization that everybody knows about, but it's a really important one, and it's called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And the goal of the organization, it's the world's largest regional security organization. So the goal is to foster security throughout its members, if you will. And there are 57 countries who are part of the OSCE, and they go all the way from Canada and the U.S., North America, to Central Asia and the Russian Federation, and basically everyone in between. And the goal is to try to promote security, safety, and human rights in that region. And we do that through all sorts of things. Some aspects of the organization help fight and prevent conflict, help to reduce conflict among countries. They might do election monitoring, where they watch elections and make sure that elections are free and fair. They do work on transnational threats, on terrorism and things like that. But one of the things that we do is combat trafficking in human beings. And I'm what's called a special representative, which is sort of a special envoy or something like that. And my job is to help support the 57 countries in their efforts to combat trafficking. And I do that through all sorts of ways. I have a team that works with me, and we go to countries and we visit them and talk with the officials there who are doing their work and try to help them work through challenges or share good practices. Like, what are some countries doing that's working really well, and how can we bring that to another country? We also do research and data collection. So, for example, we just did a paper on sort of the intersection of technology and trafficking, because that's a big topic right now, and not a lot of countries are really familiar with it. So we did a big paper on that to try to bring awareness to the topic. We also do some training where we actually work with some of the practitioners in those countries to help them do their job a little bit better. And then we bring public awareness or awareness raising to the topic of combating trafficking. And we do that through all sorts of mechanisms, whether it's social media or whether it's working with governments to raise the topic of trafficking. So we do a whole bunch of things, but the whole overarching goal is to really help countries do a better job at combating trafficking. And it's a fantastic job with a righteous mission that I really enjoy doing every day.
That's so cool. I guess, because I was walking back into this conversation after, 17 years gone, really, I'm quite curious, with the labeling of traffic, the language, the emotional fluency around it is, it's actually very limited outside of certain circles. And I was wondering if you could maybe touch on that for our listeners about the labeling of trafficking.
Yeah, so I mean, do you mean sort of some of the phrases like modern slavery that have come up, or do you mean calling things trafficking now, where maybe before, like you said, it might have just been called prostitution, or
Yeah.
all of the above?
You know what, for sake of time, let's really, I personally would love to just focus on, human trafficking versus sex trafficking with prostitution, and the labeling of, the conversation, I guess, that you guys must be combating as well between sex workers and people who feel that they've been sex trafficked. How does that work, around the world? How does that work for your office, and how do you guys identify with the people that you're doing your hardest to help?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the main thing to know about the OSCE is that we follow the UN system of the UN protocol on combating trafficking, which is sort of known by a lot of people called the Palermo Protocol. And basically, the Palermo Protocol is a convention. It's a big agreement between about 175 countries on what trafficking is. It's the first international definition of trafficking. It was a big deal. This isn't the case in other areas. Like, there's no internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism, for example, but there is on human trafficking. And it was passed 20 years ago this year.
Wow.
And yeah, it's an anniversary year. So this is an important one. And in the Palermo Protocol, that was the first place where they agreed that trafficking had three elements. It had to have an act like recruiting or transporting or harboring or receiving a person. It had to have a means, which is like using force or coercion or abusing a position of vulnerability. And it had to have a purpose. And the interesting thing about the protocol is that it outlined all sorts of purposes. It could be the purpose for the exploitation of prostitution. It could be the purpose for the removal of organs. It could be labor exploitation. It could be a whole bunch of things. And so in my position, we combat all forms of human trafficking. So for example, this summer we held a whole little one-day conference on trafficking for the purpose of removal of organs, because this is a major problem. It's one of the most lucrative forms of trafficking because they can make a lot of money for every transaction. And it's really difficult to combat because it takes place in particular secret. There's no websites where the services are broadly advertised in quite the same way that, for example, jobs or sexual services might be advertised. So anyway, we combat all forms of trafficking. And in that agreement, that convention, they specifically did not use the phrase sex work. They differentiated trafficking for sexual exploitation from trafficking from labor exploitation. So the countries, when they ratified it, they did not view prostitution as a form of labor, as some people have suggested that it be viewed, nor did they use the phrase sex work. They used the phrase prostitution and specifically exploitation of prostitution. So that's the language we use. Now, I know that other groups have really advocated for adopting the word or the phrase sex work. But I think some of the UN special rapporteurs, my counterparts at the UN, have rightly pointed out that to use that phrase makes it a little confusing about whether that should be actually viewed as work rather than exploitation. And so we've stuck to the language of the original agreement, which is prostitution and the exploitation of prostitution. But I'm, always willing to kind of understand that people have different opinions about these things, and it's not really for me to tell people who want to identify as a sex worker that they're wrong about how they identify. Mm-hmm. It's more that the language we use in our work is sort of set in stone by international law, and so that's what I follow.
No, I mean, I love that you're willing to, jump in the deep end on this conversation with me, because, one of my biggest questions, and I have to say that, I might even have a little bit of I don't want to say a chip on my shoulder, but definitely, I have questions about end the demand, because my stance on end the demand is, I think that it's a really sexy soundbite. And I think that it's possibly being misused and or, definitely being misunderstood, especially by myself at this point. And so I really wanted to get to the bottom of what is end the demand, what does that really mean? And I listened to you to a speaker series that you did where you're explaining it in a way that I was able to go, oh, see, the way that you're explaining it really jives with my own understanding that it's a far more nuanced than what is being expressed. So I was wondering if you would be willing to dive in and, kind of just dig a little deeper and help everybody else understand. Because I previously did an interview with Caitlin Bailey where we got into end the demand. And I would really like your professional kind of opinion as well as, just exploration of that.
Mhm. Well, it's a huge topic, so let me try to respond, and then maybe we'll have to break it up into pieces. But
Awesome.
it's a fascinating topic, and I think, uh, but it doesn't have to be complicated. It's pretty simple, actually. The traffickers do what they do because they want to make money,
Hmm.
right? I mean, this is just the simple concept of trafficking. Traffickers don't do what they want to do because it's fun or it's a way to spend a Saturday night or whatever. It's they're doing it to make money, and they're doing it to make, in some cases, lots and lots of money. The International Labor Organization estimates that the trafficking in human beings makes about $150 billion a year, which makes it about as lucrative as the most common, or the most lucrative other forms of transnational crime, like drug trafficking or arms dealing or so forth. So it's a hugely profitable industry or crime. And so if they weren't going to make money, then they would do something else. They wouldn't be exploiting people just because it was fun.
Hmm.
And so the concept behind in demand is that, let's try to stop people from paying for trafficking, right? And if you think about it in the context of labor exploitation, if we all stopped buying computers that contain elements or labor or services from trafficked persons, then the trafficking of people for those purposes would end because they wouldn't have a reason to traffic it if they couldn't make money. Or let's say that trafficking occurs in the construction industry. If we stop buying services from companies who are using traffic labor, then there would be no market for um, that traffic labor. In the context of sexual exploitation and the commercial sex industry, if nobody ever purchased trafficking or purchased sex from a trafficking victim, uh, there would be no trafficking because they couldn't make any money. They would have no reason to continue exploiting persons. That's the basic idea. And I think there's sort of general agreement that if there was no demand that could be met with trafficking victims, then trafficking for sexual exploitation would end. And the reason that this is important is that for decades now, at least a couple decades since the protocol was adopted, countries have been trying to combat trafficking by going after traffickers and by trying to help victims. And by and large, it's not really working. We're not ending, no country has defeated trafficking. We're not really on close to defeating it. We're getting better at responding to it, but traffickers are also getting better at doing what they do. So I think it's time to supplement what we're doing with some attention to the demand side, to try to hit it from all fronts. So that's the basic idea, and what that means is so what does that look like? And that's a whole maybe a next adventure for you and I to discuss is
Yeah.
what does it look like to combat demand? But one of the most important things I want to mention before we talk about that is that international convention, the Palermo Protocol I mentioned earlier, actually requires countries to address demand. So it's not just that we want to do it because we think it's a good strategy, although I think it is a good strategy. It's also that countries need to do it because they're required to do it, and they agreed to do it when they signed up for the convention. So it's also a requirement under international law. And that's something we've been really trying to remind countries of when they come to us and they say, look, we're doing these things and we're not actually getting on top of it. What next? And then I say, well, are you addressing demand and how can we fold that into your strategy?
Right. No, I mean, I love that you brought that up because I mean, that's obviously something that I wouldn't have known, is that the demand as part of is part of an ongoing conversation in order to be a part of the, the OSCE and be attached, with the worldwide strategy, right? And I do think it's interesting, and I the way that I feel about the quote itself, like I said, I feel like I feel like it's an umbrella for so many other conversations, and one of those conversations is about the nature of vulnerability, and how do you guys view the nature of vulnerability? Because I know that the people that purchase sex, um, I think being a human is such a complex thing, and there's a lot of polarity, there's a lot of um, open-ended discussions as to the very nature of our being. And I was just wondering if you could touch down on that for us, about the people who are being exploited, the people who are doing the exploitation, and how does that affect the demand, and how do you convince people to go deeper in seeing why they're making the choices that they are making, and why it is that they're willing to exploit others, and or in the position of being exploited?
Man, those are really fascinating questions, and I can only offer you my thoughts based on sort of my observations and my own experience. I was a prosecutor for about 13 years and worked on this topic quite a bit, but I can't speak for everyone. So my observations about vulnerability were that most of the people that I came into contact with who were in the commercial sex industry, whether trafficked or not, were often had many vulnerability factors sort of present in their lives, whether it was economic or economic vulnerability, or other sort of societal vulnerabilities, like, for example, their sex or gender, their race, their backgrounds. Maybe it was mental health or drug issues. I mean, it could have been any number of things. There were others that I came into contact with whose vulnerabilities were not immediately obvious to me. Maybe they came from an established wealthy family. They were white and privileged in many regards, and yet still something was going on there that sort of contributed to them being in some really awful and exploitative situations. So it's not vulnerability is not always something that you wear around you like a sign on your shirt. It can be challenging to identify at first, but I saw it over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And what that told me is that we need to try to do whatever we could to make sure that people were safe and healthy and were not in positions where they were doing things that they didn't want to do, particularly when it came to commercial sex acts, which have the ability to be very, very exploitive very, very easily. And so that was sort of what we saw. And one of the interesting things was that I worked a lot on cases involving children. And what we found were that in our area, which was the greater Seattle metropolitan area, about 50% of the victims that I worked with were African American, 50%. Mm. And in our jurisdiction, only 7% of the population was African American, which tells you something pretty significant. 50% were of the victims were African American, only 7% of the population. Mm. That really struck me because that was really, really concerning in terms of the racial disparity and who it is that ends up getting trafficked, because these were all children being trafficked, and who it is that gets trafficked and who they get trafficked to. So the second piece of it was that we did a lot of operations to try to arrest men who were willing to pay children for sex. And what we found is that about 75 to 80% of those men were white men, and almost all of them were gainfully employed and obviously a lot older than these children. And so when you put those sort of things together, what we saw was that there was real imbalance in power and economic power, racial, gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it really, I think, created a picture for us of inequity and exploitation before you even involved a trafficker. Just looking at who was buying and who was, quote, selling, it was really concerning. And so that sort of set the stage for what I came to understand to be a very exploitative industry and one that took advantage of those who had the least options and the most vulnerabilities.
No, 100%. I 100% agree with you. I know that a lot of the younger, so I want to clarify for our listeners and even for myself, because you've been combating this far longer than I've been a part of the conversation as a listener, which is to say that when we say children, I know that when I think of children, I think of the kids that I was, you know, working with and or being trafficked with, which was between the age of 12 to 17, 18. So what was your experience as far as like, when you say children, what's the age group that you're referring to?
I'm talking about people under 18.
Yeah. Okay.
So the youngest child that I worked with who was a victim of trafficking that I personally had a case with was 11.
Mm,
I had worked in child sexual assault for many years and had many victims who were much younger than that. But
hmm.
in the context of a commercial sex industry and child sex trafficking, 11 was young. Most of the adults that I met had all started as youth or under 18 as minors, but not all, but most.
Yeah. And again, yeah, I identify with that because I was myself was working with, kids who were 13. I was 16 and there were people that were 17, 18. So a lot of these kids, it's interesting to me because they have been traditionally criminalized. Like they're typically, I don't want to say typically because obviously not all and it isn't typical, but many of them, they have experienced oh, up here. Now my brain is going to go flat for you. They have experienced the juvenile detention centers, and they are on the run, from foster situations. And they've gone through the system. And I know that a lot of the kids that have gone through the system, that makes them equally vulnerable, in combination with their upbringing, with the behavioral patterns, with their adverse childhood experiences, I guess is what it's being called now. And I was just wondering, you know, in the theory of countering demand against end the demand, and with end the demand, you guys are going for the criminalization and prosecution of traffickers, but in countering the demand, how are more countries approaching, like how are they addressing like just childhood welfare and homelessness, and how are they educating the people of color that were marginalized and who were colonized, and so they're living with this a lot of drug dependencies and depression and suicide. Where do you even start to bring that into focus for people?
Well, first of all, you're exactly right that the nature of the trauma and the let's say adverse experiences is expansive and the scale is really hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. My experience and the data that we collected was very much in line with what you just said, Rayanne, a minute ago, which is that most of the children that we had contact with who were either trafficked or at risk of trafficking were deeply involved in the child welfare and the criminal justice system. So many had numerous detention episodes. Many were involved with the welfare system and had gone on the run numerous times with anywhere from 5 to a dozen placements. And so when you add on the sort of racial disparity that I mentioned earlier, economic vulnerabilities, and then the instability from constantly moving and being placed in new places, or being put in the criminal justice system, you can really understand how these things can snowball into a really bad situation. But let me be very clear: none of those entitle anybody to be exploited. Right? The fact that people, that children have gone through these, doesn't mean that they're targets, or legitimate targets. And so this is why I think we need to be very clear about calling vulnerabilities root causes, which sometimes you hear people do. That's not a root cause. There's nothing about those things that make you be sex trafficked or make somebody pay you for sex. That responsibility for that needs to really lie with the traffickers and the mostly men who pay for sex with trafficking victims. And instead, what we need to do is kind of pay attention to those vulnerabilities and really try to help address them, but also hold accountable those who are driving this, the true root causes, if you will, by addressing them. So let me talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think what we tried to do when I was a prosecutor was look at the problem holistically. One was to try to really understand the experiences and the vulnerabilities of people who were being exploited. And we did that in a number of ways. One is that we didn't, although we used to, but by the last several years that I was taking the lead on this, we weren't prosecuting trafficking victims at all, and we had dramatically reduced arrests and prosecutions of people who were selling sex, period. So an example would be that in 2010, I think it was, there were about 411 prosecutions in King County for prostitution, and the year that I left, there was 11. So we cut it, all from 100% almost down to zero. And the reason, it was entirely intentional. The reason was that these were people who really needed help, not prosecution. Mm-hmm. And that was my experience in working with those populations. And I didn't see really a value from a criminal justice perspective in promoting those approaches. They needed, I think, services or exit services, or they needed safety and support, not arrests. At the same time, we started addressing the demand pretty significantly. And I want to highlight something here as well. One strategy for addressing demand is criminalization. And this can be particularly useful for men who are high frequency buyers, who are very habitual buyers, who are buying or attempting to buy from children, or who are violent buyers. You really need to go after those guys because they're going to be less amenable to prevention campaigns or to efforts to try to address it through other means. However, a second and really important, equally important way to combat demand is through prevention efforts. And we did a lot of work around that in my time in Seattle. One way was that there was an NGO that did some high school education programming around King County, really working with high school students, including particularly boys, to help understand concepts like consent and mutual respect, and these concepts that are foundational in healthy relationships, so that these boys didn't grow up to be men who were viewing these exploitative situations as opportunities. Yes. Right, and really trying to reduce it. Another way, though, that was by doing some public awareness campaigns and to help them understand that they could lose their job if they did this. That a lot of companies have policies prohibiting it, and they really didn't want to lose their job for it. Another way was to sort of disrupt the efforts to buy and steer them more towards education classes instead. So I think there's a lot of ways to try to reduce demand that is not criminalization. And I think any country looking at how to address demand should look at the full comprehensive menu of options rather than only relying on one.
No, I love it. I like a lot of what you just had to say, and I will be honest, it restored a little bit of my faith. Because there's so much, there's an overload of information online, and there's a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different perceptions and a lot of interpretations of what it is and what's the best way to combat sex trafficking, and what is a sex worker, and what is in the demand, like we just had a conversation about. So just want to say thank you so much for for taking your time to address that and to have this conversation with me. I know we're running out of time here, and I don't want to hold you up too much longer, but I would love to have you back on so that we could have another conversation around this, if you would be game for that.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. I know that there's such an urgency to understand, to understand ourselves and understand the people around us in the world we live in. So thank you again so much, Val, for taking time out of your day to help us, just take that one more step towards, just towards integration. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for the great questions and for your attention to this. I think it's really important that we try to do whatever we can to address this problem, because in my view, the solution is not to just throw our hands up in the air and say it's not possible to solve it. I think that it is possible, and that we really need to do everything we can. So thanks for bringing some awareness around this, and I hope it's interesting and useful to your listeners.
No, I know it will be. And you know what? And the next time we jump on here, I would love to talk about colonization and white privilege and just privilege in general. Because I think that when we're having a discussion about human trafficking and sex trafficking, I think that, we have to understand and look back at the history, and where the privilege has come from for some, and, how we've been separated from the idea that oneness, is a collective, and to understand that, when we hurt others, we're hurting ourselves, and we're hurting others because we're hurting ourselves. So I think it'll be a super fun conversation. So thank you so much.
Rayanne, that's so fascinating that you brought that up. I let me just say this, if you don't mind, because it's so interesting to me. I think when we looked at the Me Too movement, and we looked at sexual harassment, and how women were being treated, it was so obvious to women, I think, that it was their status as a woman which was really being sort of exploited in situation after situation. And if you extrapolate that to the world of sex trafficking, I was really amazed at how, when I moved to Europe and started working over there, it was the same story, but just a different population. Instead of it being 50% African American, it was somebody else who had been traditionally exploited. It was one poor country's citizens being exploited in another wealthy country. It was a religious minority, or it was an ethnic minority, or it was a racial minority from another continent that was being brought in. It's just the same story everywhere.
Yes.
And I think what I saw when I had done some work in Canada was Indigenous populations being at the top of the list of people who were being exploited there. And when you see that over and over again, you do have to ask yourself, why is it that we have any tolerance for this system at all, when it repeatedly just crushes and oppresses the most vulnerable in our society? And I think that that's something that we really need to ask some hard questions about.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's one of the things that I love digging into. And See, now I'm really excited about the next conversation because I'm going to be like, we're just going to get a stick and we are going to stir shit up. We're going to do a little pot stirring dance and it's going to be a lot of fun. So awesome. Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. If you want to learn more about Val, where can they reach you if they have more questions or they want to find out more about how they can be of service with what you're working towards?
Well, they can go on to the OSCE website, which is osce.org. And if you go onto the menu there, you can look at what we do. And one of the things that we do is combating trafficking in human beings. And you can learn all about the stuff that we're doing. We do work in all sorts of areas, like I mentioned. So I welcome people to go check it out. And you can also follow us on Twitter. And you should be able to find our email address on the website. So feel free and shoot us an email.
Awesome. Well, everybody, you guys have a great day. And you as well, Val, you have a fantastic rest of your night, evening with your family.
Thanks so much, Rayanne. All the best to you.
Okay, you too. Bye now. Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not necessarily reflect the opinions or viewpoints of the host, producer, other guests, or sponsors. I, Rayanne K. Irving, am not, nor have I ever been, a doctor or therapist, and none of what I say is intended for professional or medical advice.